We may proceed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Ms. Temple, before the break, we were at page 12 of your affidavit, and we were beginning to deal with the appointment of a transaction advisor. You, as I understand your testimony, had indicated to Ms. Nancy when she raised this issue with you on the 6th of January that you didn't understand the need for the transaction advisor. But despite that, you go on at paragraph 65 to refer to a motivation that Ms. Nancy put to the board of SAA for the appointment of a transaction advisor. I'd like us to go there if we may. You'll find that under tab 24 at page 330. Yes. So as I read that document, apologies, Chair. So 329 is the covering email in which Ms. Nhansi refers to her submission to the board for the urgent board meeting. And then if you go over the page to 330, you will see that submission, which is entitled Motivation for Appointment of a Transaction Advisor. And the purpose reflected under paragraph 1 is to request the board to approve the appointment of a transaction advisor regarding the 15 billion consolidation debt restructuring exercise. And then what appears in paragraph 2 is the motivation, which I understand to be why the board should approve the appointment of a transaction advisor. And I'd like to go through each of those motivations with you because, as I understand your evidence, you didn't regard the services of the transaction advisor as necessary because that work had already been done. So I'd like to go through these elements and you can tell us whether in fact that holds good for each of the grounds on which the appointment was motivated. So if we start at paragraph 2.1, it is stated there that the transaction advisor will analyze all the loan agreements that are currently at SAA's disposal. What about that one? Had that been done already?
Yes, we have done it as a Treasury team, and we report on it regularly at every board meeting and interim meetings like EXCO or risk committees.
Then at 2.2, the statement is that the transaction advisor will determine which of the total funding of 14 billion is inefficient, either because it is expensive, encumbers SAA's ability to raise further funding because of the attached government guarantee requirement, or the tenure not being suitable for SAA's financial turnaround strategy. Was that work that your team had done?
Yes, we have done that, and we've also identified which out of that total funding, which of the loans were not efficient.
And when was that? Was that in your previous submission in 2015?
When we make recommendations regarding the loans, we have already said, for instance, like we had the Nedbank subordinated loan for 1.3 billion. We'd already mentioned that we need to relook at this loan and do something about it, whether we go on a 1 year, 5 year, but put it down into a proper structure and not keep it as a subordinated loan. So those are one of the loans we identified, and they come out in each of the submissions as you see it.
And at 2.3, the idea was that the transaction advisor would advise SAA on how to restructure its balance sheet through the settlement of inefficient loans. Seems to be something of a repetition of 2.2, but what is your comment on that? Was that work that had been done?
That's work that's been done, and it's not only done internally, because at year end, when we do our annual financial statements and we get our financial year end, we have firstly our internal auditors looking at everything, and then, Chair, we also get the external auditors looking at it. And on an annual basis, SAA had to apply for a going concern letter, and so they had to do this, compare the balance sheet and see how we needed to restructure it. So that exercise was done, and on an annual basis.
And 2.4 envisaged that the transaction advisor would advise SAA of the strategic loans that, on the face of it, appears to be inefficient. However, for strategic reasons, it will be important for SAA to keep the loans in place. For example, if these represent equity funding that shores up SAA's balance sheet. I'm not sure that I understand what was going to be done there. Do you? Can you assist me?
Thank you, Chair. I will explain. With SAA becoming its own state-owned company, it first fell under Transnet, and it was a subsidiary under Transnet. In 2006, it started that, or at least the process started that they separate SAA from the Transnet, and SA became its own Schedule 2 company. When SA broke away from SAA's bigger balance sheet, Transnet's bigger balance sheet, SAA's balance sheet was high debt to equity. In fact, it had no equity at that time. And so it had this debt profile, no equity, meaning it should have, it had cash at the time, but it had no substantial equity that could strengthen the balance sheet. SA had no assets. Its aircraft was all leased. The buildings that SA owned at that time was minor, very small, so it didn't make an impact on revaluation of its assets and liabilities, that it would show that there were strong assets available for SA. So from an equity basis is that if the government owned the organization, they would put equity into it. And like with Transnet, the government has put in cash equity into Transnet. With SAA, there was no cash equity, and that's one of the reasons that with the earlier board that walked out, they were trying to stabilize that balance sheet through saying, yeah, you have a high debt to equity balance sheet. How can you manage and run this company? It's not going to work. We need to stabilize it, and we need to bring in proper equity. And so what I'm understanding here, Chair, is that they're saying to keep the loans in place and to represent where there's equity funding. SA had no equity, and it meant we either needed to get another company to buy out percentage or whichever amount to put in cash equity, then to stabilize the balance sheet, or they had to try continue then with the loans, which was the option we were taking at this point in time, because we could not go for equity without National Treasury permission. Thank you.
Thank you for that background. In terms of this work, though, was this something that you were looking at? It sounds from your answer as though you were engaged with it, and in fact the going to the market decision was based on the need to get cash into the entity. Would this have been something that would have been new for the transaction advisor to do?
No. Just to go back to the equity funding, etc. Yes, we're involved from a treasury basis, but if one's looking at the whole full balance sheet and the equity structure of it and its debt, it's then done with external auditors and internal auditors and from a finance. But yes, I have been involved in that process, especially when it comes to the going concern. And personally, no, I don't think that SA would have needed a transaction advisor to tell them that. They knew already through the history of SA.
And then finally, over the page at 2.5, there's a requirement that the transaction advisor would analyze the current SAA leases, the majority of which expose SAA to hard currency exchange prejudices, given that approximately 60% of SAA's revenue is US dollar denominated. And with the 5 A330s that will commence shortly, that will result in approximately 85% of SAA's expenses to be US denominated, and recommend to SAA of options to restructure these leases to lessen their burden on SAA. What about that aspect? Was that something that a transaction advisor could be introduced to work on?
Chair, this was already worked on prior, because the decision has already been made through board. It went through a fleet committee who had sat and looked at what availability SA had with its aircraft, which ones were old and needed to be downgraded, and which ones they needed to purchase new and upgrade new aircraft. So this whole exercise was done by a fleet committee, and this committee goes through board. So this was already approved at board level, so there was no need for transaction advisor to come and give additional advice.
Thank you. So that recommendation goes to the board, and if we return to your affidavit at page 12, you reflected paragraph 66 there, that the board did approve the appointment of a transaction advisor. If we can go to that those minutes of the board meeting, you'll find them at tab 25, starting at page 333. You'll see that that is minutes of the special meeting held on the 16th of January 2016. And you will see, if you flip through that to page 340, there is recorded the decision in the minutes in relation to the transaction advisor services. Can you read for us at page 340 under item 4.11, please?
It states here the appointment of the transactional advisors for funding options. It was resolved that the board hereby approves the request for appointment of a transactional advisor to advise regarding the 15 billion debt consolidation restructuring exercise.
You make the point at paragraph 66 that this was before any process had been followed that identified a need for those services to be procured. What was your concern?
My concern was that the Treasury team were already in the process of seeking funding, and we started the process from 2015 already. At one point it was stopped, we put it out again, and in December we were sitting with almost approved proposal that needed to go through. Then FTC was brought in, which we then sent the RFP out to them, so we were now into January, and we had still not finalized the process of debt consolidation because we didn't get any feedback from the interim CFO at the time, Ms. Nhansi. Thank you, Chair.
Ms. Stimple, you then go on at paragraph 67 to record that a request for information went out. I don't believe it's relevant to look at that in too much detail, but if we go on to paragraph 68, you talk about on the 3rd of March having received a BAC submission drafted by the commodity manager, and that set out the proposed evaluation criteria for this transaction advisor services RFP. You will find that commencing at page 345 under tab 27. The documents here have been arranged slightly out of order, so I'd like to take you into that file divider to page 348, because that, as I understand it, is actually the BAC submission that you were provided with. There's a lot of annotation on this page. Can you enlighten us as to whose annotations those are?
Thank you, Chair. These are mine. I received this document to approve, so to get the BAC to support the evaluation criteria for a transaction advisor. So since the date, early January, when Ms. Nhansi had said, oh, we would like to get a transaction advisor, we've had nothing in Treasury that we're going to put the process in place. The process works that business drives it. You take it up from business level up to board. You don't just go directly to board for approvals. And there, for the first time, I received this for the evaluation criteria. I read through it, and then I discovered that there will be the source of funding. given that I haven't yet seen the board minutes that was decided on earlier that we've just gone through, so I'm totally unaware. The transaction advisors, we haven't got feedback yet from the FTC, and so we still have all our RFPs open for all the other respondees, and then they bring in sourcing of funds. So I immediately tried to meet with Ms. Nahansi on this, and she was unable to see me. I tried to see Mr. Matsaudi, Silas Matsaudi, and he was also busy, so I couldn't see him. And then I just made these notes as I was writing it, and then I subsequently sent an email to them to say, please, can we discuss?
Can I pause for a moment just to get clear through your evidence, Ms. Dimple, the difference between a transaction advisor and a sourcer of funds? Because as I understand your testimony a moment ago, one of the things you were concerned about in this submission was that there was, in addition to transaction advisor services, to be a sourcing of funds element. Can you please explain to us what that difference is?
Thank you, Chair. I'll do that. So transaction advisor will look at what you've tasked him to do firstly. So he has a mandate, and in this case, SAA had a clear mandate for the transaction advisor, and he had to do certain things. One of them was to look at our debt portfolio, see if we could restructure our balance sheet, look at the aircraft leases, etc. From a perspective of a person who's going to, or a company who's going to be sourcing the funds for you, this person will go out and seek funds from the various entities who are willing to provide the funds. And again, from that perspective, as SAA Treasury, it was Treasury's responsibility to go and source those fundings from the banks. And in this case, they added in, board added in non-financial institutions. To now pay for someone to go and do the sourcing of funds is where I draw the distinction. Why would you go and increase your costs to the organization when you already have people doing the job and have been doing it in the past? Thank you.
And over the page at 13 of your affidavit, you summarize what the nub of your issues were with the draft evaluation criteria that you had been presented with. And that is conveyed in an email, which you'll find under tab 28. But your summary at page 13, paragraph 69 is useful. Can you give us an indication of what your principal concerns were with those evaluation criteria and this process as it was unfolding?
Now, going through this actual request for support for the evaluation criteria, I found that there was ambiguity in it, in that they were asking to assist with reviewing and analyze the organization's loan book, but at the same time seek source of funding. So what was their main mandate? Because it says to source funding and evaluate funding, and you go to source is the one, and evaluate. The initial understanding was that we need to evaluate the existing funding, and then they bring in the source. And so I'll challenge that to say, what are we trying to achieve here? We need to be more specific in what we want to do, and why would we want to source funding when we're already doing it and we already got our RFP that's still open? There was another issue that was we needed to ask the organization to demonstrate how have they sourced funding before. And we know that the banks do it all the time. So why are we now going to seek another entity to try and replicate what we know already and has been done?
As you refer to it under C in paragraph 69, that term that I was using earlier seems to come in about a middleman.
Yes.
You say there, in my capacity as head of Treasury, I did not believe that SAA needed a middleman to source funding. I'd previously worked directly with South Africa's major banks to source funding. Is that something that you conveyed to Ms. Nhansi and others?
Yes. We've said that many times in our various meetings, whether it was the CFST meetings or with Ms. Nahansi herself, especially the day she called us, the transaction advisor. Secondly, is I was really against it because I felt we didn't need to get a middle person, another company to source those funds, and we were on an extreme cost drive for SAA. So why do we need to do that? So yes, I did explain it a couple of times, and I think she understood that.
And what follows then, if we go to 356, which is under tab 28, Ms. Timple, your email, as I have it, is in the second half of the page. That's where you write to Ms. Nancy and you set out these concerns which you've summarized for us. And then her response is above that the following day on the 4th of March. She writes there, "Hi Cynthia, you can come through and I will give you background as the TA," I take that to be an abbreviation for transaction advisor, is that correct?
Agree.
"Needs to be approved by BAC today." So what happened when you met with Ms. Nhansi about that?
Ms. Nahansi then told me that she already had board approval for the transaction advisor and that she would email it to myself and to Silas Mzansi.
And then if you go back to your affidavit, what you indicate there you received was that motivation that we've looked at previously, the 15 January 2016 motivation. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what did that show you about what had or had not been approved by the board?
That showed me there were elements of what that transaction advisor should be doing, but there was no sourcing of funds in that document at all.
And so what then happened with your efforts to maintain this delineation between transaction advisor services as compared with sourcing of funds?
Mr. Mzansi, then he also had a copy of this letter which Ms. Nahansi had sent us. He then updated the submission for the BAC, which is the Bid Adjudication Committee, and on that basis I then signed the document after reviewing it.
Did it make the amendments that you required to keep it confined to transaction advisor services?
Yes, Chair, it did. It covered just the basics of each of those points that were listed in the original letter.
And if we just go to it at 359, which is under tab 29, you'll see precisely as you describe those 5 bullets that we went through, 2.1 to 2.5 of Ms. Nhansi's motivation, appear now to be the design scope of the transaction advisor services at page 359. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
You mentioned that there was a short period of time in which bidders could respond to a request for proposal in line with this evaluation criteria. What was your concern there?
From the supply chain management policy, the SM policy, they have a minimum of 2 weeks. And for this particular one, they put out, I think it was 1 week. I know it was less than the specified time period in the actual SM policy.
Yes, I think it was a week. At paragraph 73, you say that the request for proposal went out on the 11th of March and then the submission period closed on the 18th of March. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, it's correct.
And then if we go over to page 14 of your affidavit, you there deal with the responses that were now received in relation to this request for proposal. Can you take us through the entities which submitted proposals? And you'll find that at paragraph 74.
Yeah, so we had a list which provided their bids, Chair, and it was from Deloitte and Touche, Regiments Capital, Basis Point Capital, Singer Holdings, Nacella Capital, Nedbank Limited, and BNP Capital.
Right. I would then like to go to the Bnp Bid Submission, which is the next document in the bundle under flag 30. And the reason for that is I'd like to highlight with you some of the requirements of that RFP, because they are going to become significant later when we delve into the question whether the BNP bid in fact satisfied the requirements of the RFP. So if we may, you'll find that's commencing at page 370, and that was under flag 30. And you'll see that that's a document headed Request for Proposal, Appointment of a Transaction Advisor to provide financial advice to SAA, and then it references the bid number. What appears to have happened is all of the bidders took this RFP and then populated it, as I understand to be customary, with their relevant information. So this is the one that was populated by BNP. Chair, just to make a note, this is not in fact the complete BNP bid submission. We have subsequently sourced that from SAA, and it will appear in one of the subsequent bundles. But for present purposes, it's sufficient to work on this document, because this will identify the key criteria that I'd like to deal with Ms. Stimple. Ms. Stimple, if you'll first go to page 384 of that RFP document, which now comprises the BNP bid information. You'll see at 384 under item 18.2.6 that the RFP is dealing with the BEE submissions that were required to be provided by bidders, and it stipulates that bidders must submit their triple BEE certificate. It goes on to record that consortiums or joint ventures must submit a consolidated BEE certificate. Each member organization must submit the percentage income split as per the consortium or joint venture agreement. The workload split must also be clearly defined and indicated. Is that fairly standard for BEE submissions in relation to supply chain management?
Yes, it is. It's in their policy. It's a standard request.
So that's the first one I want us to take note of. The second one is at page 386. That is the requirement that the bidder have a financial services board license. You'll see that under critical criteria. That is something that you flagged in your comments, is it not?
Yes.
And explain to me your comments in relation to that license.
The reason for that is if you're looking for advisory services, there are companies like your KPMG's, Deloitte's, that offer advisory services, especially as for transactions, and they don't have FSB licenses. And so to get a client specifically for FSB licenses, this became part of the criteria now for the transaction advisor. I obviously argued against that. It was one of, I won't say argument, but it was one of the issues I raised, saying we're excluding others. If we just reduce it to FSB, then we have a smaller group, and then we will limit our pool. And so that was one of my main reasons that I felt we could have broadened it.
But as I understand it, you didn't win that battle, so to speak, because it remained a requirement of the bid that there be an FSB license. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Chair. That's what and I accepted that. If that's the we're going to have, then we need the FSB license.
And then if I could take you over to 392, which is another aspect of the RFP. This one we're looking at has been filled in by BNP Capital and submitted when it bid. But the point that I'm interested in on that page is towards the bottom of 392, where it lists documents to be submitted. And amongst those documents, you'll see the fourth bullet point there. Can you read for us what document was required to be submitted there?
The signed joint venture consortium agreement, where applicable.
And in the context of this bid requirement, I read that to mean there was, Chair, an opportunity for bidders to bid in joint venture or consortium. When they did so, they had to produce a consolidated BEE certificate. We've looked at that. They also had to be clear about who was doing what work, so that there could be a proper assessment about where the work was really lying. And then this seems to be a further requirement that there would need to be a signed JV or consortium agreement if indeed that applied to the bidder. And then we go over the page to 393, and you'll see there, this is BNP's bid submission, and you will see that in the part beginning bold under the bullet points, there is a section where, in case of a consortium or joint venture, full details on the consortium or joint venture members must be filled in, if applicable. And there we have recorded Inline Trading 10 Pty Limited. Do you see that?
Yes, Chair.
Ms. Temple, we'll come to it in due course, because you were subsequently engaged in the process of recommendation for the appointment of the transaction advisor. What I'm interested in knowing is whether you knew at the time that BNP had bid in joint venture with this entity called Inline Trading 10 Pty Limited.
Chair, I had no idea. I had no idea that Inline was their joint venture. The most I saw was the final list of names which came up in a document which I was also asked to sign. At that point, I also wanted to see the files, and they said there was no need because there are two bid committees. There's the bid evaluation committee, and then there's the bid adjudication committee, and they said they've reviewed everything. So once the bid evaluation committee's done it, they have done their, because there's a full checklist, then they would have made sure everything is correct. So I did not know.
We'll come back to the potential significance of that in due course. If we return to your affidavit at page 14 now, we've looked at the bid that was submitted. You've made it clear at the time you did not see this document. And then you explain at 76 that you were away for a period of time. Can you tell us about that?
My mom-in-law took ill and subsequently passed away, and so I left to go to Germany, and I stayed there until we buried her, and that happened around the Easter weekend.
And just to get the chronology right, you indicated paragraph 76 that you were away from the 19th of March to the 29th of March. So just, we recall the bids had to be in on the 18th of March. That was the deadline. And so for that first 10-day period of evaluation, you were away. And you make the point there that neither you nor Mr. Klein were invited to take part in that analysis. Would you ordinarily have done so or not?
The fact that it was a transaction advisor, that would have been part of our work. So it would have been either someone from a treasury or a finance, or probably from the fleet management. Yes, because the idea of a cross-functional sourcing team is to get people from various, so when you're looking at a bid, you have knowledge from the various sections that can add value to it. And so I would have, because many times we've been called to sit in on bids. I've been on IT bids. If it pertains to anything that's going to affect my area, I've been on the banking tender because it's my area. I've even been on the fuel tender earlier years. So it depends where, and they rotated, so there will be people that will be called in to sit and review those bids.
But you didn't take part in that process?
No, Chair.
I'd then like to move to paragraph 77, which relates to a document at page 424 under tab 31. Now, as you reflect in paragraph 77, this is a letter that notified BNP that it had been awarded the tender to provide transactional advisory services. Ms. Stimple, what's curious, at least on its face, about this letter is its date. You will see that it is dated 20 March 2016.
Correct.
You make the point that, well, first of all, let's be clear. Were you aware of this letter at the time?
No, Chair, I was not at all aware.
And it's dated 20 March, which is 2 days after the bids closed. You'll see from the later documents we look at, the bid adjudication process hadn't even been finalized by that stage. Chair, just to make a note, it is not clear to us whether it was in fact sent to BNP on the date of the 20th of March.
Yes.
It is an aspect that we will traverse
Explore.
in the evidence next week.
Okay,
But we
that's
just note now that it's
Dated
unthinkable
21.
that the date
This-
could be the 20th.
20th, yeah.
Indeed, because none of the processes of evaluation have run by that stage. You will note over the page that the acceptance of this letter by BNP and the director there, Mr. Mahlangu, is only dated 25 April 2016,
Yes.
which tends to suggest it probably went out later than this. That may have been an error. We don't know. We will explore it.
Yeah, okay.
Chair.
But back to the next annexure, which is annexure 32, because, Ms. Stimple, this is, as I understand it, the recommendation that was then put together by the Global Supply Management Team after they had completed the evaluation process. And you'll see at page 427, it's dated 15 April 2016. I'd like to spend a bit of time on some of the aspects of this recommendation. But I first want to get one aspect out of the way. You will see at page 436 that there is the page in which the various supporters and recommenders sign the document. And this recommendation page bears a signature of Ms. Nhansi, but no signature from you. Is that correct?
That was initially, yes.
But there is a version of this which you did sign later,
I did
as I
sign
have it.
it, yes.
And we were able to source that, Chair. You will find that in bundle C, page 915.1. It comes after the tab A2. Sorry, not A2, after the tab A3.
And the actual pages?
Is 915.1.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
So, Ms. Stimple, can you confirm that that is your signature?
Yes, it is my signature, Chair.
And I'm going to come back to
The
it.
first one from the top.
Yes.
Okay.
Indeed. Spelled correctly. Ms. Stimple, I'm going to come back to probe with you a bit why you saw fit to recommend this appointment, because we've heard evidence from you about your great misgivings about a transaction advisor being appointed to do the very work that had been done. But before I get there, I'd just like to look at one or two aspects of this recommendation. You mentioned earlier that you were not aware of this joint venture in which BNP Capital had bid. And you said that's because this recommendation did not reference that anywhere. And I'd just like to take you to the parts of the document that certainly confirm that. If you go back in bundle A to page 434, you will see a table of the consolidated scores for the price and triple BEE. And you'll see there, as the entities are listed, it's Nedbank, Regiments, Nasela Capital, BPS, and BNP. There's no reference to a JV or a consortium.
Correct.
You'll find, again, support for that at page, if you go back a moment to page 249, because the names of the bidders who have responded, again, are reflected only BNP Capital. There's no reference to a JV submission, despite what we saw previously in the actual bid documentation. And then if we just return to page 434, you'll also see there that item 11 and that table contains the consolidated scores for price and BEE, And as I read this table, this is really the outcome of the evaluation process, because this was a 90-10 procurement scenario. 10 points were going to be applied for triple BEE, 90 points for price, and you have the consolidated analysis there of the various bids who had passed the initial disqualification phase. You'll see there that Nedbank scores 9 on triple BEE, and BNP is a little bit under that at 8. Those are the first and the last columns. And then you'll see it's really price, which in a sense clinches it for BNP, because they come in at a value of 90 on price, and that ends them with a total score of 98 out of 100. Is that a fair reflection of what we're looking at?
Yes, for understanding it as it is. This is what we are given, at least I was given, based on everything that they would go through all the files, and this is what I would work on. So yes, that is a fair summation that you've made, yes.
If you go to item 13 on that page, there were some risks that were identified in relation to BNP Capital. What is recorded there is that the risk associated with contracting with BNP is allayed by the fact that the agreement is not a supply contract that requires a capital outlay. The capability to deliver is embedded in the proposed team and the bidder's experience, hence the 100% score on functionality. What I understand that to be a reference to is actually the document that you find at page 437, because that's a summary of the financial assessment of the bidders. And what I'd like to do again is just contrast the financial assessment of Nedbank on the one hand as bidder 1 as compared with bidder 5, which was BNP Capital. You'll see that Nedbank is recorded in the last sentence there as based on the above, the risk for this bidder has been assessed as low. And then if you go to BNP Capital, you'll see the concluding statement is that based on the above, the risk for this bidder has been assessed as high. That seems to have been what informed that risk comment, which is that although there's a determined high risk in relation to BNP, that was, in the views of the team putting this together, sufficiently allayed by those factors that they referenced, that there's not a supply contract and that the capability to deliver was embedded in the proposed team and the bidder's experience. Did that cause you concern when you were reviewing this at all?
It did raise concerns with me. In fact, the whole process continued raising concerns with me. Reviewing the entire document, and then looking at the final outlay for SAA from a financial risk perspective was the cost of 2.6, and based on what they were going to do was just give advisory advice to SAA. On that basis, I decided, let me sign it, and let's see what they have to offer. Maybe there's something that I'm not seeing that they can raise. And on that basis, I signed it.
I'm going to go through some of the deficiencies in the BNP bid with you, and I'd like to have your comment on whether, had those been known to you, you would have signed on to this recommendation. But before we do that, if we can just go to page 435. There's a note at 435 from the financial controller at the bottom of the page. You'll see under signatures, there's a signature from the financial controller shared services right at the bottom of the page, and then there's an annotation not budgeted for. What do you understand that to mean?
Every division has its own budget. And
I'm sorry, is that at 435?
Yes, right at the bottom, Chair, you'll see handwritten, not budgeted for, under item 2.
Yes, thank you.
And Ms. Dimple, you would just explain to us what that would mean in the context.
Thank you, Chair. Every division, business division in SA had its own budget, and we had to manage that strictly. So any new service you're going to take on needed to be in that budget, or if it's an existing service already, you must have had that budget, because we have a process that every year we set up our budget. For this particular one, there was no budget for it, and that's why Mr. Pierre would have signed it, because his role is to check every amount against the budget when he goes through it before he signs it, to say yes, there is a budget, or no, there is not. And that's what he's indicating here.
And then if you go over the page to 436, there seems to be a response to that note from Ms. Nhansi. Could you read for us what is written there next to her signature?
Ms. Nancy states, the budget will be catered for under the CFO's cost center.
Whose cost center would that have been?
So that would be the Chief Financial Officer's cost center. They had a separate budget. I have no idea what the total balance is or what that budget is on an annual basis. And I just hope she had availability.
That's her budget,
That's
so
her
to
budget,
speak.
correct.
Thank you. I'd now like to just deal with you, put to you some of the perceived deficiencies with the BNP bid, so that we can have your comment on whether, if these had been brought to your attention, you would have recommended the appointment. Ms. Dimple, in your testimony a moment ago, you made it clear that the financial exposure on this appointment was not particularly high. It was in the order of 2.6 million. Is that right?
Correct.
Well, some of the issues in relation to the bid, and Chair, this is an aspect that will be traversed in evidence to come, but it is appropriate to have Ms. Stimple's comment on it at the moment. I won't require us to go into the documents. When we're dealing with the relevant witness, we will do so. But just for your comment at this point, Ms. Stimple, if it were to be shown that BNP's bid, albeit identifying that it was bidding in a JV with Inline Trading 10 Pty Limited, contained no information about that partner bidder, would that have been a concern to you?
That would have been a concern to me, and it should have been raised in the document by the bid evaluation committee, because that is their role. They're supposed to identify all these issues.
If they had supplied no consolidated triple BEE certificate, would that have been a concern?
Yes, definitely it would have been a concern.
And if you learned that the price that they submitted with their bid was quoted, and I'm quoting here from the bid submission, along the following lines: because of the envisaged methodology and complexity of the project, we propose a fee of R1, excluding VAT, plus a fee to SAA on the successful adoption for implementation of advice. What would you have made of that?
Definitely not. Definitely, I would have said there's something wrong here. How can you go in and put in a bid for R1?
Excluding VAT.
And excluding VAT.
Yes.
There was something very wrong with that.
Well, that will be an
Well,
aspect.
Forget about VAT. R1.
Just makes it sound even less than the R1 if you, or more in the end, R1.15 now. Those were the aspects, Ms. Stimple. I take it if that had been known to you at the time, you may not have recommended that they
I would
be
have
appointed.
not. Yeah, it was just unfortunate, the process we're running with the bid evaluation committee. They get to see the documents, they go through it. It then comes, as you can see, the first lot signs, and we get the final ones. And even then I wanted to see the document, and I was told that the bid evaluation committee had done their work and they've done it thorough. So, and on that basis, I thought I've put enough resistance, and I'm sure a second opinion wouldn't do any harm. And on that basis is why I recommended it. But knowing everything else that you've just mentioned, yes, I would definitely not have recommended it. Thank you, Chair.
Just tell us that request to see the underlying document. Who was that made to?
It was made to Amanda Kutsia, and to Silas Mitsatsi.
And you remember that specifically,
Yes.
that request that you made?
Yes.
Thank you. Let us then, if we may, return to page 14 of your affidavit. Because you now move to a section which is headed Sourcing of Funds. And one of the engagements we had earlier, where you provided some background to us of the difference between transaction advisor services and sourcing of funds now becomes quite pertinent. Because as I have it in the story, Ms. Stimple, at this point, what BNP Capital has been appointed to do is to provide transaction advisor services. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And what then develops as the evidence and your affidavit progresses is that their scope was changed from transaction advisor services to sourcing of funds. And you pick that up at paragraph 80 at the bottom of page 14. This is the date that you referred to earlier. You'll recall you were in some limbo in the early part of 2016 to get clarity as to the position in relation to FDC and the previous RFP. Sure. Can you tell us about what happened on the 20th of April 2016?
So leading up to that time, we had no feedback what was happening with FDC. We had also not closed the RFP, and we couldn't go back to any of the respondees. And so we called a CFST meeting, which is the cross-functional sourcing team, on the 20th of April with Ms. Nahansi, for her to please give us feedback and advise what is happening with the funding, because we had key maturities happening on the loans, and we needed to get back to the banks and to the respondees of the RFP. In that meeting, Ms. Nahansi actually wanted to know who called the meeting and why is it being called. And I had said I needed clarity, and that's why we called it, because we're all part of this, the team, and we need to know so we can take further action. And then at that meeting, she mentioned that the FDC is off the table. Those were her words. And in that same meeting, she said, now that we have we have BNP as a transaction advisor, we can use them to source the funds for SA. And that's when we all challenged it. The one member, Lindsay Olitsky, brought up the fact that if you change the scope of the procurement transaction, there's the amount involved, and it shouldn't be more than 15%. This was way more than the 15% upfront already. Secondly, we all raised between ourselves, myself, Mr. Lusenga, Mr. Makora, all raised that we need to rather go out and put a full RFP out there and rather get a complete new RFP and not get the current transaction advisor to source funding for SA.
Ms. Timber, as I've understood your previous evidence, you raised concern about utilizing any third party to do sourcing of funds in circumstances where that had been done internally, traditionally. Is that correct?
No, yeah, it's correct.
But now you're at a point where you're told that there's FDC is off the table, and there's going to now be an expansion of the scope of the transaction advisor to source the funds. And as I have it, if you pick it up at 81, over the page 15 of your affidavit, you record there precisely what you've indicated, that you said to Ms. Nancy that she would need to follow a competitive bidding process for the sourcing of funds, if that was to be the next step.
Correct, and that was putting out the RFP process, getting this full competitive bidding out there, and then doing the proper analysis. Correct.
Now that was on the 20th of April. Further down in that paragraph, you talk about what happened the very next day, on the 21st of April. And that, as I have it, was the board's decision to extend the scope of the transaction advisor. Is that correct?
Correct.
Let's go to that, and you can now, Ms. Stimple, move to the B file, because the annexures we'll be working on for the remainder will be in the B file. And there we will go to the first tab, which is 33. And that is a decision of the board of 21 April, in which they approve the extension of scope of a transaction advisor to include sourcing of funding of 15 billion for South African Airways. Do you see that?
Yes, I do see this. And again, the way it should work is that business drives it, and business should have done it from the beginning, driving it through to be approved at board. What's been done here is that Ms. Nahansi had taken a letter directly to board to get approval, and they've approved the transaction advisor.
Ms. Temple, there's another aspect of this resolution that I find curious and I'd like your comment on. The board resolved, as it is recorded here, to approve the extension of the scope of a transaction advisor to include sourcing of funding of 15 billion for South African Airways. Was there any other transaction advisor at the time besides BNP Capital?
Not that I'm aware of, Chair. As far as I knew, it was the BNP who were chosen at the time.
But despite that, there is then a whole process that seems to be followed, and you'll take us through it, where there's a request for a confinement so that you don't have to go through a competitive bid, and then a proposal that BNP be appointed as the sourcer of funds. That just seems to disconnect from this resolution that was taken on the 21st of April. Do you accept that that is an oddity?
I do, definitely.
But your evidence seems to suggest this was becoming a pattern.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. Because what I've been seeing is it's the same. That first in January was the initial approval for transaction advisor, and then only it comes through the bid adjudication committee. Then change the scope of the transaction advisor, then it comes through the bid adjudication committee. That is not how SA should be functioning from a corporate governance perspective. Business drives it. If there is any discussion between the CFO, etc., on what we're going to do, we make the recommendation first and then get the approval. Here it's been working back to front, where we get the approval and now you drive it through the governance process. That's incorrect. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Timber. I have been asked to request again that you speak a little bit closer to the mic, maybe draw it towards you if that would be helpful. You make that point in summary at paragraph 83 of your affidavit, page 15, and then you move on to the date of the 6th of May, 2016. Can you tell us what happened on that day? So we've moved forward a few weeks. The board resolution is 21 April, and now we move to 6 May, and there's an interaction between you and Ms. Nhansi on that day.
Come the 6th of May, I get called into Ms. Nhansi's office, and she puts a document down in front of me, and she says, "You're always challenging me and asking me questions, so I'd like to discuss this with you first before you get to sign it." So I said, good. And then she showed me the document. She said the board gave approval for the transaction advisor to change the scope and to source funding for SA. She's already spoken to the client, BNP Capital, and they've already reviewed and they've come up with, they're prepared to do it. They can source 15 billion and their price. So the first document that I saw was for 15 billion sourcing of funds, they were charging a fee of 3%. 3% on 15 billion is 300 million. Immediately, I just said to Pumeza, I'm not signing this. I pushed it back and I said, I am tasked in my balance scorecard to save 300 million for this organization by year end. And the only way I was going to do it is to reduce the interest rate on our borrowing. Otherwise, there's no other way. And I said, now you're going to wipe it out with one transaction that we're going to sign. Her words to me was, oh, I didn't think of it that way. But I'll go back and renegotiate. Even then in the discussion, I said to her, I will go to the banks and see what they would offer. But I know the banks will give a better rate. They've never charged us such a high fee. They may add a margin in the interest rate, but for arranging sourcing of funds, they don't charge us that amount. And then she said, well, the president was coming to SA's offices on that day, and she said, well, I've got to go meet the president. Can we meet on Monday? And I said, I'm not here. I did put in my leave. I'll be going away on a pilgrimage from the the Monday for the week. And then she asked, who will deputize for you? And I said, Michael Klein will be deputizing. I immediately went back and I asked for a copy of the memo, and she said, no, you can't have it. She'll update it and send a new one and discuss it when I return. I left to go and chat to my deputy. I told him what happened, and I said to him, please don't sign anything in my absence. Secondly, as I said, can you please get pricing for what the banks would offer on 15 billion? And when you get the letter, review it, or the memo, and then hold it till I return. He agreed on that. Thank you, Chair.
Let's take a 5 minutes adjournment. We'll adjourn for 5 minutes.
All right.
we may proceed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Ms. Stimple, we were at paragraph 86 on page 15 of your affidavit, where you record there that you were going to go on leave and you gave feedback to Mr. Klein about your meeting. And as I read it, you record there that you instructed him not to sign the BAC submission in your absence. Was it as clear as that, Ms. Stimple? Ms. Stimple, please just turn on your... Yes,
My
sorry.
apologies.
So just clarify for us. I asked you, was it as clear as that you instructed him not to sign it?
Yes, I instructed him not to sign it, and he also clarified by saying, no, I will not sign anything without
While
your
you're away.
knowledge and you're not here. Correct.
I want to skip over paragraph 87 and come back to it, because it's useful for us first to see what happened, in a sense, in SAA on the 11th of May, which we pick up at page 88 over the page 16 of your affidavit, and then we can talk about how that interfaced with you outside of SAA on your leave. So if we start at paragraph 88, you'll see there that you record that on the 11th of May, the South African Airways Global Supply Management Unit made a request to the BAC to support the confinement and award of the contract for sourcing of funds for SAA Group to BNP Capital. And let's look at that document. It's under tab 35 at page 445. So this, as I read it, is the GSM, that's the Global Supply Management's request to the BAC to support the confinement of the contract to source funds to BNP Capital. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And that background on the page that we see under the bold heading is the same background we're familiar with. That's what the transaction advisor was originally procured to provide as a service.
Correct.
And then you go over the page to 446, which now contains the motivation for this extension in the scope of the transaction advisor's services. Could you read for us what's recorded there as the motivation?
Loans to the value of 7.3 billion are maturing on 30th of June 2016, and SAA is obliged to settle the loans on or before the maturity date. Due to time constraint, the only feasible approach is to engage the appointed transaction advisor to urgently source the funds required to settle the loans. Sourcing the funds was not included in the transaction advisor's scope of work, as SA believed that the funds could be successfully sourced without the transaction advisor's assistance. The outcome of SA's efforts to secure funding without the assistance of the transaction advisor in the market has proved otherwise. It is against this background that GCM, on behalf of the business unit, is requesting for BAC to support to confine and award the contract for sourcing of funds to settle the loans maturing on 30th June 2016 to BNP Capital Pty Limited. A duly signed confinement declaration form is attached in Annexure A.
Thank you. I'd like to just pause on some of those propositions. Let's go back to the point about, due to time constraint, the only feasible option is to engage the appointed transaction advisor urgently to source the funds. What is your comment on that? Would you have supported that as a motivation?
No, would not, because we've always been in a time constraint and we've managed it. We've had loans maturing, we had to roll them over, we had to seek a board approval and then go back, and it is a constant going back and forth to board, getting the approvals, then to National Treasury, because once the loan matures, you have to do a new agreement. So it was something we were doing as almost a daily basis. We knew that, so I wouldn't have called that a constraint that we needed to go now and source the 7.3. Whatever was maturing, we were going to roll over anyway.
And if, against your view that you've just described, there was urgency, where would you say that urgency arose from?
For me, the urgency arose through board's delays, I felt, in the whole delay starting from 2015. And then on our interim CFO, who at the time, had she told us the FTC was off the table in January and not in April, we could have already made plans of how we're going to roll those funds ahead or gone out for a new RFP. By then, we could have at least managed the process. But we were always waiting, being told to wait, and sort of on the back burner. And that, I feel, was where the urgency came about. Chair.
I'd like to pick up that point. You do address it later in the affidavit, but this question about whether you can justify a confinement of a procurement process on the grounds of urgency, because that is what seems to be lurking in this motivation, that because of this urgency, we must confine to this particular existing service provider rather than going out competitively. And you make the point later at paragraph 92 that SAA's own procurement policy clearly states that poor planning on SAA's part can never be regarded as a ground of urgency. I'd like to take you to that policy just so we can find that provision. You'll find it as one of the supplemented documents in file C, and you'll find it there at page 890. Well, let me just orientate you. The document begins at 868 under tab A1. Is that the supply chain management policy you're familiar with?
Correct.
And then if we go to within that policy, page 890, you'll see there, Ms. Stimple, a section dealing under 11.13 with limited or confined bidding. Do you see that?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And it gives circumstances in which under sub 1 SAA shall use limited bidding only in the following exceptional circumstances. And it lists the circumstances. But at 11.13.1.6, I think is the point that you were making in your affidavit. Would you read us the provisions of that clause?
Yes, it states that bad planning shall not be acceptable as justification for the use of limited bidding.
What was your view at the time? Had there been bad planning?
I felt that there was, because we had ample time to put out, and why were we rushing this now, taking an existing transaction advisor who was only tasked and mandated to do certain transaction, and now opening the scope so broad to go out and source funding, and then pushing the approval to say it's because we need to source funding with immediate effect or else SAA will be in jeopardy. So, yes, I agree.
Ms. Stimble, there's an odd circularity, I would suggest, and I'd like your comment on to what is happening here, because you'll recall you've already testified about the initial inclusion of the sourcing of funds in the RFP that was going to go out for these transaction advisor services. You took issue with that, as I have your evidence, because you said, but the board has not approved a Sorcerer of funds in January 2016, so our request for proposal must be faithful to what the board has approved. Is that correct?
Correct.
The consequence of that is that there's a process, BNP gets appointed as transaction advisor, and then shortly thereafter there's, in a sense, a resurrection of the source of funds issue, and now a process to confine to BNP getting that deal, in a sense, from SAA. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Well, let's look at what financial implication that was going to have for SAA. And that appears at page 446, where we were dealing with first the motivation for this confinement. Tell us what the financial implication says in that first paragraph.
The industry norm is that the transaction advisors charge a success fee from 2 to 3% of the funds sourced, and SA negotiated the percentage with the transaction advisor. The two parties settled for a success fee of 1.5% should BNP be tasked to urgently source the funds. Indicated below is the projected success fee to be paid to BNP Capital if the transaction advisor succeeds in sourcing the 15 billion required to settle all the loans. The success fee lies not in a once-off payment. The terms will be negotiated with the transaction advisor to ensure that the payments of the success fee are staggered.
And then what is the total liability on that success fee as recorded in the table that then appears?
So based on their success fee, they've chosen a 1.5% of 15 billion, making it 225 million. If you included at that time, it was 14% VAT, would have made it 256 million rand.
Well, let's go back to the financial implications, because you had an interaction with Ms. Nhansi just before you left to go overseas, at which you recall a 3% figure was being debated. And as I recall your evidence, you said you'd made it clear to her that you were concerned about how high that fee was. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
What then is your comment on the statement here that the industry norm is that transaction advisors charge a success fee ranging from 2 to 3% of the funds sourced?
Still, I don't think I disagree with this. I know there will be other schools of thought, but I disagree with such a high fee. Banks charge basis points, so it's a percentage of a 1%, for instance. So they'll go 35, 25, 50, 85 basis points for them arranging for the funding. Where they would charge it on the margin. So for instance, if they're saying, I'm going to lend SAA at JIBAR 6.5%, I'm going to add on the 3% margin, and they will charge us the interest rate of 9.5%. But they're not going to add it in for sourcing a fund. So I disagree with that statement that this is the industry norm. And but that's my view. Thank you.
But it does seem as though at least the position had moved from when you met with Ms. Nhansi, because if 3% was on the table then, the second part of that sentence records that there's been some negotiation down to the 1.5%. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
But you are away at this point in time, is that correct?
Yes.
You did not receive this, is that correct?
That's correct. I did
And
not
if we
receive
go
it.
over the page to 447, that's quite clearly reflected because your name is scratched out and that of your deputy, Michael Klein, is included. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And what does he signify there next to his signature?
He writes there, he signs it and states recommended under the premise that the company is under pressure to arrange funding.
Ms. Stimple, if we go back in your affidavit to paragraph 87, which was on page 15, the one that I said I wanted to return to, you indicate there that you received a WhatsApp message from Mr. Klein on that day.
Correct.
Tell us about that message.
So the reason I was away, if it was normal leave, I would have stayed. But it was a birthday present from my husband. It was a pilgrimage walking from Paris to Chartres. And it was a 5-day pilgrimage which I was doing. And which I got in December and could only take it in May because that was the date the pilgrimage was running. So I was away walking in between small towns. And on this particular day, which was, I think it was the 11th when he signed it, and he sent me this message saying, I was put under pressure to sign. I did sign the document. And with that, I was immediately upset in that how could he sign without me being there? He had promised me that he wasn't going to sign it. We were going to discuss it. And I then immediately went to the head of our group and said to him, when we get to the next town, can I take a few minutes? And he said, fine. So there I did. I went to sit quietly and I actually wrote a message to National Treasury, the two people that I deal with, Miss Avril Halstead and Mr. Ravesh Rajlal, and I wrote to them. I said, this is a WhatsApp whistleblowing message. I don't know how else to do it, but I've just received notification that a BAC document has been signed to pay a small client, and I said I really don't know anything about the client except that they were going to be our transaction advisor, and we were going to pay them 2.6 odd million, and now they're going to be sourcing the funds for SAA, and I said at a fee of, initially I said 300 million. Michael, in his message, had corrected that by saying 1.5%. So I said the figure I wrote is wrong. It's actually 225 million. So I wrote this message to National Treasury because I was concerned. I just felt, why are we pushing this agenda? All this time we've been delaying funding. Why suddenly do we have to take this client, and why do we have to pay them this phenomenal fee? Thank you.
You've provided us with a copy of that WhatsApp communication that took place while you were on your pilgrimage in France. You'll find it at page 443, which is under tab 34. And Ms. Temple, you'll correct me if my sense of this communication is wrong, but it really does read as though it's sort of moments in time that are developing, because it starts, you'll see the date in the text, 2016-05-11, so that's the 11th of May, and it's at 8:15. And then you talk about everything you've described. You say it's a whistleblowing report, it's a whistleblowing message, and you apologize for having to send it by SMS, and you'll say you'll do a formal email or letter. And then you go into the details as they've been relayed to you by Mr. Klein, and you there reference the 2% of the quantum. But if you go right down the page, there appears to have been a second message later, what seems to be just before midnight. You'll see it sort of 5 lines up from the bottom. That reflects as 11:24:09 p.m. And you say, it's Cynthia Stimple speaking, you say the success fee has now been changed to 1.5%, and you go on to raise your concerns in relation to that. And you reference there in the last line, Michael said he signed the BAC doc as I was not there, and the interim CFO has put him under pressure. Best regards. That's quite something to do on a pilgrimage. Did you feel strongly about it?
I just felt that this was wrong. This isn't our approach. We should be following funding. And the fact that we were doing this showed that we wanted to enlist someone who wasn't, and pay them this huge fee. On what basis? When we've been rolling funding, we've been doing funding over the years with the minimum cost to SAA. So yes, I felt strongly about it. I had to take time out. I literally sat at a coffee shop because they had Wi-Fi, so I could do this. And that's how I did it. Thanks.
Well, despite that WhatsApp message, as I have it, 2 days later on the 13th of May, the BAC did approve the decision to confine the sourcing of funds to BNP. You reference that at page 17 of your affidavit from paragraph 95, and you'll find that BAC document at page 453, which is under tab 37. I'm interested just to pause at this document for a moment to look at the various options that are given to the committee when it makes its resolutions. There seem to be various options. They can approve, they can recommend to the board, they can refer back for rework, they can decline, or they can note. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so what we see signified there is what decision on the part of the BAC?
It's recommended, and one sees there that it should go to CEO, EXCO, audit, PTPC, for recommendation to board. Correct.
And then there are some conditions contained at the bottom. I have struggled greatly to decipher what these conditions record. Are you at all better placed than I am to decipher those conditions? Is that handwriting that's familiar to you? I mean, my bad attempt, but we will ask Ms. Nhansi about this because she references it in her statement. It seems to be the main being.
It looks like
The main
reason.
Basis.
main
of
basis
support.
of the support is to get funding,
Due
and then something
It's due to the
Yeah, due
urgency.
to the urgency.
and
Practicality, maybe?
practicality of the required
We're all
funds.
trying.
Of the required fund is offered to the best something
Rate in the market.
rates in the markets.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, we'll explore that further, but the bottom line as I have it is that the BAC then on the 13th of May recommends to the board that that BNP be appointed to source the funds. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
But you're still away at this point, is that
I'm
right?
still away at this point, yes.
Okay. You then go on in your statement to deal with the BAC submission checklist that was that accompanied the submission that went to the BAC from the GSM. I'd like to take a look at that. And there are actually two copies of it in the papers, and the better copy is at page 448. So if we can go to 448, you will find that under tab 35. You raised some concerns about the content of this BAC submission checklist, because as I understand your evidence, there are,
I'm sorry, what was the page number?
apologies, Chair, 448.
448.
So we go back a bit in the file under tab 35.
Yes.
You make the point at paragraph 96 that this checklist contains really the areas of compliance that need to be satisfied, or of which the BAC needs to be satisfied when it makes its decisions. And you highlight how many of these items of compliance have NA next to them, not applicable. What concerns you about that?
So the purpose, clear description of the submission, they've put down yes. Then confirmation of signed business case. That meant the motivation around it. They've got not applicable. Details of the lender, number of bidders. So because they put it in a confinement, they put it as so they didn't need to look at that. Details of the tender bidders, not applicable. Bid evaluation, not applicable. Financial due diligence, not applicable. Bid award recommendation, not applicable. Financial impact assessment, not applicable.
Why? Sorry,
Assessment
could I
of fee-
pause there just for a moment? Because
Okay.
I can understand why you would say not applicable if you're not in a bid scenario, right?
Yes.
But financial impact assessment, would that not still be relevant even if you were confining?
I would agree, it should still be. You need to still review it.
And what about assessment of
And-
fair value?
Yes, and risk assessment.
But all of that is indicated as not applicable.
Correct. Had it gone through a true process of checking, comparing, taking the transaction advisor as is, and open it up, and then doing a full comparison, they would have then reviewed that, for instance, picked up the FSB license or picked up any other shortcomings regarding the client then. At the time, pardon?
So where it says assessment of fair value not applicable, is it correct that what it in effect means is don't worry about whether there is fair value or not?
Yes, and this is done by the...
That's not our concern.
Correct. That's how I would assume it.
Okay.
The GSM, because they were now confining it, felt that there was no need to go through the full checklist again and ensure that you have all your criteria in place. Thanks, Chair.
Right, and then we move to page 18 of your affidavit, if we may, because we're now at the stage where you have returned. You say at paragraph 98 you returned from your leave on the 17th of May, and you get a fuller account from Mr. Klein, and he gives you a copy of the submission that he signed. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And then from the 18th of May, you, for want of a better description, snap into action, because you are now going to the banks to get hypothetical quotes. Ms. Stimple, why did you do that the day after you returned?
When I returned, I first sat with my deputy, Michael Klein, and got the information from him. And I wanted to know what exactly happened. How was he put under pressure? Was there a gun held to his head, etc.? And he said that he was called to Mr. Lester Peters' office, who literally, his words were, jumped up and down and told him, you don't take responsibility here, so you just sign. And based on that, Michael said he signed it. I was still concerned, and then when I came back to my desk, I tried to arrange a meeting with Ms. Nahansi to discuss this further, because when we left, she said she was going to wait for prices, and we would discuss it. She knew that I was going to go away. I couldn't get hold of her, and I decided, well, I'm going ahead anyway to get prices in the market and see, and at least have comparable prices that I can put forward to her, so she can see there is a strong possibility of saving costs for SA. And so that's what I did. When I sat at my desk, I thought, do I go to our major banks? I know that the banks talk to one another, and the minute you talk to one bank, the other, they all know what's happening out in the market. So I wanted to limit it. So I then worded my email under a hypothetical quote, and I then only sent it to 3 banks. So I sent it to Standard Bank, I sent it to ABSA, and I sent it to Rand Merchant Bank.
Let's go to that email in which you make the request for a quote. You'll find it at page, I'd like to start at page 460, because these email trains work from the bottom up, so to speak, in terms of time. So if you go to 460, which is under tab 39, you'll see there your email sent to ABSA Capital. And the subject is hypothetical quote, as you've described. Can you read for us the text of your inquiry?
Thank you, Chair. I will do so. I wrote Dear Thuli, who is our relationship person at ABSA Bank, and asked her, would it be possible to give me a hypothetical quote on the following? I'm trying to benchmark some numbers, please. This is purely hypothetical. Should SAA go into the market for a transaction advisor or funds arranger for an amount of 15 billion, what would be the fees for this service from yourselves, please?
And then her response is above that. What does she come back with?
She writes back the same day, Dear Cynthia, arranging fees are generally lower than 10 basis points, and you'd also need to factor in participation fees for the lenders and the arranger, which usually range between 25 to 40 basis points. A deal can always be made.
I understood your earlier evidence to be basis points are percentages of a percent. So we're talking in terms less than 1% now. And remember, for the purposes of this part of your evidence, it's useful to keep in mind that what's been proposed and BAC approved is a 1.5% for BNP. And as I have it, you've returned and you're concerned about the extent of that fee, and so you're now engaging with banks to get a comparator. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Is that something in your view that should have been done prior to the settling at the 1.5 with BNP?
Yes, definitely, Chair.
If you turn then back a page to 259, we can follow the email train. You then respond to Mzulu and you say, would this be calculated on the full quantum amount of borrowing? Let's say it's a total of 50 basis points on 15 billion. thanks and regards, and then she
I'm
responds to that.
sorry, what page is that?
Apologies, Chair. We back a page
We were
at
at
4.
460?
Yes, so we go back to 459,
Okay, thank you.
just to follow the
Yes.
email sequence. So, Ms. Temple, you go back to ask about whether that percentage that she's quoted, as I have it, would be influenced by the total quantity. So you say, would this be calculated on the full quantum amount of borrowing? And you say, for example, let's say a total of 50 basis points on 15 billion. And then her response is reflected above that. What does she come back and say to you?
And she writes, not quite. The arranger will earn the 10 basis points, and then in addition, their portion of the debt will be 25 basis points of participation fee. So in essence, one party will have 35 to the maximum of 50 basis points, and others there could be 25 to 40 basis points because they are only participating.
And then
I
she
negotiate, and then she writes there, I'll negotiate hard to get close to 25 basis point, given the quantum involved.
Right, and then you thank her as I have it, and then on the 20th of May, you start communicating with Ms. Nhansi about this quote, and you'll find that email under tab 40 at page 462. So what, if you could give us just the essence of this email, what are you communicating to Ms. Nhansi on this day?
Yeah, my intention was to raise the concern of us having gone ahead to approve the BNP to source funding at BAC. The next level of approval was going to go through the obviously EXCO, FIPCO, Audit and Risk, and board committees. And I was hoping to stop that because I felt that with us getting a better rate, we can still stop it and do a comparison and then make a decision on how we're going to go forward. And so I sourced these prices. I got the reason why there's a delay from when I came back to the 20th. I was waiting for RMB to come back to me as well. And so I submitted to her what RMB was saying and what ABSA had said. I even went to the extent where I drew up a little Excel table just calculating on the amount and saying, this is what BNP is charging us, this is what the banks are charging us, and if I went with the maximum amount the banks would charge us, this would be the fee, and the fee came to 85 million. By then I realized we could definitely be saving costs if this is the route we're going to go, and so I wrote to her, and that was the essence, raising my concern and that we should do a full comparison.
I'll go into the detail of this email in a little bit of time, but there's something I just want to pick up on something you said. You indicated that you wrote to her on the 20th of May because you had been waiting for further responses. I think you mentioned RMB, but I want to draw your attention to page 466, because 466 appears, at least to me, to be the response you got from RMB, and that is after the 20th of May. It is the 25th of May.
Yeah.
Am I reading that correctly then?
That's correct, yeah, because I was waiting for them.
You hadn't received RMB?
I hadn't yet. I was still waiting for them, but I went ahead with what I had so that she already had some figures on the table.
And that, so then, can I just clarify, because I'd understood you to say you had RMB at the time of the 20th of May. You've now clarified that that's not the case.
No, sorry, I haven't had them, but my reason for the delay, I came back the 17th. I didn't respond the 18th or the 19th. By the 20th, after getting my first one, waited another day or two, and then I thought, let me respond at least with what I have on the table.
And so the table is reflective of what you'd received by that stage from ABSA, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Right. So let's just look at that email at 462, if we may, because you're raising some concerns for Ms. Nancy's consideration. You say in the second paragraph after the first break, you say, therefore, I'm still very uncomfortable with the document that has been approved by the BAC for a fee of 1.5% to be paid on the success rate fee with BNP Capital, and thought to ask you whether we can still reconsider the decision taken to confine to one service provider rather than open this wider to all. That appears to have been your consistent concern, is
Yes.
that right?
And rather open it to wider all. Yes,
Yes.
that's what I requested.
And then
Thank you.
at the end of the next paragraph, you raise a reputational risk issue for SAA. Can you explain to us what your concern was there?
That we've been going out to the banks since 2015, Chair, already. And so the banks knew that we were seeking funds. Part of the other activities we did with banks, we met on a regular basis between National Treasury, SAA, and the funders because they wanted to know what was happening with SAA, especially if there's major changes like a CFO change or any major events that happen in SAA. So for me is that if we now go out and we're saying we've got this client, which personally I knew nothing about. I tried to Google them and find nothing about their website, wasn't much to find out the work they would have done and achieved in sourcing huge capital amounts, is that what reputation would SAA face being associated with a small client like this sourcing 15 billion? So that was my concern.
And then you conclude by saying you're available on your phone if she wishes to discuss it further, even over the weekend, or else you say you could meet on Monday. And you say, as this is imperative, that we review and reconsider this proposal in order to save money for the company and keep this company's best interest at heart. That, again, seems to be your persistent concern. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
We then go to paragraph 101 of your affidavit, which is at page 18, where you record there that Ms. Nhansi decided not to draw your attention, your concerns to the attention of the board, and instead sought to secure their approval. And you indicate there that the approval was granted by round-robin resolution on the 24th of May. You say, though, that you weren't aware of that at the time. Is that right?
That is correct.
So
I
your
was-
your communication with Ms. Nhansi is on the 20th. You're volunteering to meet over the weekend to discuss it further, or on Monday. On the 24th of May, approval is given, but you're unaware of that.
I'm unaware of that. I did
So-
not know it was approved at the time.
So what did you do on the 25th of May? And you can pick that up at page paragraph 102.
Yeah, I subsequently got the response from Rand Merchant Bank and then forward that also to Ms. Nhansi saying this is the second one, and again, it's still a ballpark figure that I've calculated. I've built this table and there can still be substantial cost savings for SA, and I submitted that to her. At the time I got, when I sent that to her, I was then told that it's already been approved via round robin.
Well, before we get there, could we, because Ms. Stimple, with respect, you don't seem to leave it at the email. You engage in other modes of communication on the 25th. So the email goes out. I've now got RMB. This is what RMB is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just summarize RMB. Was it coming in around the ballpark that you'd received from ABSA?
Correct. They were in that range. So, RMB gave additional information. They even gave around, if you were looking at the capital markets, which I didn't even ask for, they gave additional information, which was great for us to then also look at. So yes, I still had the concern, and because I knew there was a board meeting coming up on the 27th, I didn't realize on the 24th that they had done a round robin. I was still looking at the meeting coming up ahead, and having sent the email and not having any response, I thought, let me engage Ms. Nhansi further. I then sent an SMS saying, please, can we meet, can we discuss, there's still this, can we look at it? And then she responded to that.
Thank you, Ms. Stimple. I do want to just pause for a moment at the RMB quote. You'll find it at page 466. Chair, the reason for spending a little bit of time on this is because one of the points that are taken up in Mr. Zwani's application to cross-examine Ms. Stimple is that the quotes that she sought to get from the banks were too hypothetical. There wasn't enough information in them, is the nub of the criticism as I read it. And you referenced, however, that what RMB had come back with was actually some level of detail and alternative ways in which you could structure the funding, as I read that email at page
Correct.
466. They seem to be dealing with 3 scenarios there. Can you just take us through what RMB was saying?
Thank you, Chair. I will do so. So the first one is that we expect that SA would prefer to raise RAND only, that's ZAR, and understand that the funding is largely going to be raised in order to restructure existing debt. As such, we believe that a bank loan package will be most appropriate. In order to assist SA in arranging the bank package, which we are assuming would be government guaranteed, we would charge a fee of approximately 50 basis points of the total funding raised. RMB would be mandated as the lead arranger. Then point 2, if SA wished to raise funding from a capital market perspective, we expect that 5 billion would probably be the maximum that could be raised in the SA market with a government guarantee. We would charge a fee of 20 basis points of the amounts issued. RMB would be acting as lead arranger for the issuance. On the third point, if SA wished to access the full amount of funding from the capital markets, a US dollar bond, which is also government guaranteed, would be more appropriate. We would charge a fee of 30 basis points of the nominal amount issued. RMB would be acting as joint lead manager, and we would recommend that at least 2 other joint lead managers are appointed who would share the proposed fee. Please note that due to the limited amount of information that we have, the above is still purely high-level indications.
Thank you.
And so, if I may also just clarify here, asking the hypothetical quote is for the banks. Had I gone for a pure quote, the banks come back with a quote and you need to give specific information. At that time, I felt I couldn't divulge what was happening around the BNP issue, and I needed to at least get some figures so I could compare and do comparable analysis with the fees that we were getting. And so hence, that is how I worded my emails. And from both Absa Bank and RMB, they understood what I wanted because they came back with the pricing where there was additional prices to be paid either as lead arranger or for any other additional fee, for instance. They added those basis points in. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we were just at the point where you engaged on SMS with Ms. Nhansi because there hadn't been a response to your email, and you'll find though that SMS communication at page 471. That's under tab 43. Ms. Timble, I'm not going to ask you to read all of that communication, but what is the gist of it as you recall it?
In my message, it was basically to again say that, to raise the point with Ms. Nhansi that I was away and came back to find that this was, or the BNP was approved, and then I wrote there, it is unethical for us to pay this large amount when we know we can get better rates in the market. Then Ms. Nhansi responds by saying that we need to have a meeting to make me understand. Her words are, Cynthia, I think we need to have a meeting and make you understand that at the end, the board and executives take the decision, not you. We have a crisis on our table and I need money.
And if you go over the page, that is actually better, that part of the correspondence is better reflected because you have the top part, until I need money, but then Ms. Nancy's message goes on. As I have it, she says, I need money urgently, and you keep on questioning the process. Unfortunately, I'm here to stabilize the airline and do what is right. It's not my problem that you decided to go away without even my leave approval. as I have said, if you have questions, if you have questions about this, talk to me next week. I do not have time, please. And then if you go over the page at 473, your response, please, and then she goes on, in fact, you need to explain what is unethical about this, because that is a big statement that undermines our integrity. And what is your response?
I then say, please, I have asked for a meeting and would like to meet, and I have sent an email regarding my leave on the 5th of May already. I was struggling to book the leave on the system because she alludes to me going without her approval. Yeah.
And then the last bit of the communication is at the bottom. What is her response?
She writes, as I've said this week, it's madness for me. You can set up a meeting for next week.
Now that's happening on the 25th of May as I have it. As it so happens, the board had already decided to approve it the day before. Is that correct?
Correct.
And just so that we can see that board resolution, let's go to it. It's at page 480. And it's under tab 45. It reflects again a round robin situation. Just tell us about that round robin situation, because you mentioned earlier in your evidence that there was a scheduled board meeting that you were aware of. Is that right?
Correct.
So when was that scheduled board meeting to take place?
On the 27th of May.
So when you're corresponding on the 25th, you are still in a position where you assume that's when it's going to be discussed.
Tabled
Is that
at the
right?
board. Correct. That was my understanding, because especially a matter of this nature should be at a proper board meeting. I did not expect that it would be done by a round robin, but to explain how the round robin works, Chair, is that the documents are sent via email to each of the board members, and they then have an opportunity to respond. They can either obviously go to read it, and then they can approve or not, and raise any concerns that they have via email. And this is all coordinated through the company secretary's office. Thanks.
So that round robin approval was given as of the 24th of May. And so the decision has been taken to procure funds, well, to allow BNP to source funds for SAA, and the letter of award that then goes to BNP goes the following day, the 25th of May, when you were having that correspondence with Ms. Nhansi, and you'll find that at page 490 under tab 46. And this is really the last aspect, Chair, because I see we're close to 4 o'clock, that I propose to deal with today, because we'll move on to the last topic, which is the cancellation fee after that.
Yes.
But let's just look at 490. Ms. Stimple, this is a letter of award, as I read it, congratulating BNP Capital on being awarded the contract for sourcing of funds for South African Airways. And they record there, kindly note that this letter of award is subject to the following conditions. And those conditions include that the letter sets forth SAA's understanding of the terms and conditions of our engagement and the nature of scope of the services to be provided in order to ensure that both parties are aware of their responsibilities. Goes on under 2 to say the letter of award and any other correspondence dealing with the subject matter constitutes the essential elements of the terms of our engagement, and in the event of any inconsistency, the agreement shall prevail. And at 3, any services rendered by BNP prior to signing the agreement will be governed by SAA's general conditions of contract. And it says that they hereby extend congratulations, and they ask for acceptance of the award by return. And you see over the page that does come back later on the 3rd of June. Ms. Stimple, are these terms standard in letters of award that specify that the terms and conditions of the engagement are contained in the letter of award or not?
The letter of award would then have the full terms. This doesn't cover any of the, it just says letter of award sets forth the terms and conditions of our engagement. So there had to be an attachment to this. I don't see any. I have no idea how the SEM department worked on this. If this was done in the Treasury Department, we would have only sent a letter to say that they have been awarded this, and we will follow on with the terms of agreement, because that needs negotiation between both parties, legal department, etc. And so it would have been between SAA and the client's legal team, and that would have been the correspondence. If this was the only letter, it said sets forth, but there's nothing in here that covers it that I can see.
Chair, what we will move on to tomorrow is the cancellation fee that arises from this. What is noteworthy, and we'll commence with it, is that on the very same day that this letter is sent, a letter is received from BNP Capital in which they are motivating for a cancellation fee of 50% of those fees that they would have earned on the sourcing. But we'll go into that in more detail.
Thank you. And we start normal time tomorrow?
I think normal time, Chair,
Normal time
because
should do.
we've gone quite swiftly. There's a bit
Yes.
more to deal with Ms. Stimple, and then there is a second witness, but I'm confident we'll conclude that in the day.
Okay, okay. We'll adjourn for the day, and tomorrow we'll start at 10 o'clock. We adjourn.
All rise.